All right. Our guest on this episode today is Gentry McCreary, who is an anthropologist. And
No,
No.
I
I'm
got
not
that
an
wrong right off the
anthropologist.
bat. I got that
No.
wrong.
no.
Okay. All right. So
A
I'm going to
mere
let you
so-
introduce yourself.
A mere social psychologist, not an
Yes,
A social
he's
psychologist.
one
I'm
of
gonna-
my
I'm gonna let
people.
you-
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you introduce yourself, actually. But I want to say one thing before I let you do that is I want to apologize to you because when I first reached out to you, I called you Dr. Gentry because I think I got your name wrong because I thought your last name was Gentry.
It happens a lot.
So,
Yeah.
so
I've leaned into it. In fact, I had a blog for a while and it was Dr. Gentry's blog. So no offense at all was taken.
okay. Well, I just wanted to point that out and just say I'm sorry about that. So since I already insulted you twice now because I've gotten your profession wrong, I probably
Oh my
should
God.
know
We're
that
off
about
to
my
a
guest.
rosy start. We're off
Right.
Good
to
job,
Good
Dimitri.
job.
Good job.
Why,
You got
Why don't
right
you just-
into it. You got right into
Why-
it with the hazing.
why not?
Right.
That's right. This is how we started on our shows. We tell you what you are.
yeah.
That's what we do. Why don't you
Breaking
just
me
tell
down before
us-
you build me back up here.
Why don't you tell us what you do? And what I do know that I'm right about is that you created dyad strategies.
That's right.
And why don't you tell us what you do and what dyad strategies is and what kind of research they do?
Yeah, so my background is in higher education. So I worked in student affairs and specifically with Greek life on college campuses, including about 5 years as the director of Greek life at the University of Alabama, which was a really interesting job. If you've seen the Bama Rush documentaries or any of the craziness that is Greek life at Bama. So I rode that dragon for almost 5 years. And then did my PhD while I was at Alabama, which is really what led me into this work. I was interested in a number of topics, but took a course in moral psychology from Steve Thoma, and that just opened my eyes to really what I wanted to do with my career and what I wanted to study. So a paper that I wrote in that class ended up becoming the proposal, and so looked at fraternity hazing through the lens of moral psychology, kind of neo-Kohlbergian moral judgment, Bandura, moral disengagement, some of that stuff. So that was really what got me into this work. And then teamed up with my then research, now business partner, Josh Schutz, who's a quant guy, stats guy. And we started just doing some research that we were interested in. So we were just kind of scholar practitioners out there, both working as university administrators, publishing research around hazing, brotherhood. And some groups approached us after a conference presentation, probably in, 2015, 2016, somewhere in there. And they said, hey, we really like this research you're doing. Would you do some research for us? And we said, oh, you'll pay us to do this. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So we began the company then. And so Dyad Strategies has partnered with 20 national fraternities and sororities. And then we do a lot of campus-based work as well. And in essence, what we do is survey research. So we've got a number of instruments that we've built, some of which are inspired by Aldo's research. So our hazing motivation stuff really gets at his macro theories, so social dominance and loyalty, commitment, and solidarity. And so we measure that. We measure tolerance for hazing. We measure affinity, brotherhood, sisterhood, social culture, about 25 data points that groups use to measure the impact of the things that they're doing. And then to identify problems before they're problems, right? So the insurance companies really like us. We help our clients essentially say, hey, these handful of chapters, they're maybe going down a bad path. We need to do some sort of an intervention before something happens. So in essence, that's what we do. We're survey researchers, and we work primarily with fraternity and sorority members, but do some work in athletics and with other groups as well. So that's in a nutshell what we do.
Okay. All right. So the reason that we wanted to have you on is because you're an expert in the topic that we spoke about last week, which is hazing. and because of this Northwestern story, which I do want to ask you about. But I wanted to ask you first about the definition of hazing, because that was one of the things that we debated last week. A lot of the definitions that come from people that don't do the research, from the media, from universities, it surrounds the definition being something about humiliation and doing things that people don't like to do. But that's not the definition that dyad strategies and the researcher that we talked about, Aldo Simino, that's how you guys define it. So how does the research how does the research section, I guess, is, for lack of a better way.
I'll try to channel my inner Aldo here, because Aldo and I are in total agreement on this. And he pronounces it Cimino, by the way. So it's Aldo Cimino.
Cimino.
Very Italian.
0 for 3, so
Italian.
I struck out. So there we
go. Aldo's work has been a tremendous inspiration to mine. So Aldo and I were writing our doctoral dissertations around the same time, and I read his first article, the 2011 article, not long after I was finished, and that was such an inspiration. Aldo's the only living anthropologist who studies hazing, so he's really looking. Most of the other people who've studied hazing are mere low social psychologists like myself. Aldo is his research is so important because he's been able to in his field work literally embed himself and observe what's going on with hazing fraternities, and he's done some really interesting lab experiments, some of which you talked about last week. But Aldo's definition, I think, is right, and Aldo would say there's so many bad definitions out there that are overly vague, that can be so broadly interpreted. And so Aldo's qualifier around group relevance is really important. And so if you think about, let's take a fraternity versus a football team, since we're going to talk about Northwestern, this perfect example. If you're on a football team, physical fitness is very group relevant, right? So like running laps, running stairs, doing all that, like that is very relevant to what that group is going to be expected to do. With a fraternity, that's different, right? It's not the same. So there's this question of group relevance. And so we took Aldo's definition, and in our model policy, essentially what we said is any activity that is not group relevant and is excessive, degrading, demeaning, or illegal. So those are the 4 qualifiers that I use. And so if it's group relevant, it might not be hazing, even if it is a little excessive, right? So for example, running laps as punishment, a basketball coach making everyone run laps, that might look different if he's just making the freshmen run laps or targeting them out for different treatment. But I think that notion of group relevance is one that's particularly important. And people weren't really talking about that until Aldo came along and kind of offered that definition. They were just trying to offer these catch-all definitions and apply them equally across the board to all sorts of groups, and it just wasn't working, right? And students were challenging it, and you got a lot of pushback. And so essentially what Aldo's definition has allowed us to do is to be a little more subjective about it and look at any activity that any group is doing and apply some criteria and determine, does this make sense for this group or does it not? And I think that's really been a valuable addition to the conversation.
Well, I'm glad you brought up your model policy, because I did read it and I wanted to ask you something about it. In the model policy towards the end, there are banned policies. So certain things are, you recommend certain punishments come up if certain violations are, I think the section is 3 for prohibited behaviors. And a few of the prohibited behaviors, I'm reading bullying, cyberbullying, disruptive activities, disorderly conduct, endangerment, things like that. Hazing has its own section.
Sure.
But why would hazing not be bullying, for instance? And why would it not be endangerment? Because when you look at, for instance, what happened at Northwestern, and you said one of the definitions may be legal, but what they were doing how is that not illegal or endangerment or bullying? So
I think it's a
where's
lot
the
of things.
delineation?
Yeah. So that, and
Where
to
does
be
where
clear,
does
what that
hazing
model
become those
policy
things?
is it's a model organizational misconduct code. So a lot of campuses, they've got these codes of student conduct, right? And that's what they use to regulate student behavior. And the challenge that we saw is that they were trying to awkwardly graft student organizations into those individual student conduct policies. And it wasn't working very well. And so, for a campus who needed to investigate and adjudicate, for example, a fraternity who's hazing, those individual codes of conduct weren't really well designed to do that. And so that model policy is really a framework for here's how you should handle this stuff when we're talking about a group, any group, not just a fraternity or sorority or a sports team, any student organization on campus. Hazing and bullying are very similar. In fact, when I started writing, when I wrote my dissertation, I could count at the time on my two hands the number of good published articles that were out there related to hazing. There wasn't very much. And so I pulled a lot of my theoretical framework from the fairly expansive literature that was out there on bullying, because there was a lot more at the time. Hazing obviously being different because it's about exclusion from a group, right? So you want either membership or participatory legitimacy in a group. And that might be very different from just individual. I don't like Dimitri. I'm going to mess with him. I'm going to bully him and pick on him. It doesn't have anything to do with a group context. That's just me messing with him. And so because of that, the group psychology that often shows up in hazing, there's some things that really make it distinct from bullying. And so I a lot of similarities, a lot of overlap, but some distinct differences as well.
Yeah, I think the group aspect of hazing, like you mentioned, might make it a difference. But where I'm puzzled is that one of the criteria I mentioned is that he has to be, if it's not group relevant, then that might be qualified as hazing. But who decide if it's group relevant or not? Let's say that the seniors say that, oh, the hazing it's in the benefit of the group for cohesion, or for you have to go through those tests to make the team, and we are going to be better for it. So that in itself is group activity, group relevancy. So is there a mechanism, or should there be a mechanism, or to actually say this is not group relevant and you should not be the one saying it is, or the school says it is, or the coach says it is, not the players?
Yeah, and that's the critique of Aldo's definition, is that it is subjective, right? It requires you to sit down and evaluate an activity and decide, A, is this group relevant? And then if we decide that it is, then B, is it dangerous? Is it degrading? Is it excessive? Is it illegal? Different people might fall on different sides of that. The lawyer answer, and I'm not a lawyer, but I work with lawyers a lot, is it's kind of the reasonable person standard, right? Like what would your grandma think? If your grandma's a reasonable person, like, would she think it's group relevant? If she thinks so, like if I could convince my grandmother that it's relevant to the group, then yeah, I could probably convince a jury that it's relevant to a group. So, at the end of the day, when it comes to these cases, yeah, like that's ultimately the definition that matters, is the legal definition. And I think that's certainly going to come into play at Northwestern based on the flurry of lawsuits that have been filed in the last couple of weeks.
Right. So in your experience, seniors have a leeway of deciding what's group relevancy. The coaches or the hierarchy of supervision don't have any say in what the group decides to do, or the seniors decide to do for the group.
Not necessarily, right? I mean, it depends on the group. There's no hard and fast rule. I was fascinated by your all's conversation last week, and Stefan, I think it was you who said that this. What we see at Northwestern, this has to be just proliferant throughout college athletics and fraternities and sororities, that this is just the group that got caught. And I actually disagree with that a little bit. And let me explain. I just watched Oppenheimer the other day and I loved it. And I thought this would be a good analogy of like tightly controlled environments, like Los Alamos Laboratory, very tightly controlled environment. Not too far below that, I would put Division I Power 5 football locker room, right? Like there's nothing that happens. What was going on with Northwestern is not at some house off campus in a basement. Like, this was happening in the locker room, after games, after practice. That is such a tightly controlled environment. There is no way that the responsible adults who were supposed to be in charge didn't know what was going on. Like, just not possible. So in that situation, you typically don't see that sort of thing happening with a sports team, certainly not at that level, Division I, Power 5 football, because the coaches just don't allow it. Like, that's silliness. That's like, it's not contributing to the team's culture. They might have other fun little traditions that people might define as hazing, getting on a table and singing the fight song or something like that. And then we could say, okay, is it really demeaning? Is it really degrading? Is it really humiliating? Yeah, maybe not. But does it build that team culture? Does it break down barriers? Is it group relevant in that way? Well, right, maybe. But within a fraternity or sorority or a lot of other groups, but I think fraternities especially, you have 19, 20, 21-year-old young people with absolute power over the lives of the 18-year-old new members who are joining. There is no coach. There is no responsible adult who ultimately has any power, which is why you typically see the most egregious hazing, certainly the hazing that most often leads in injury or death, almost exclusively limited to fraternities and to a lesser extent sororities. You never see severe hazing within college athletics, almost never. There was a case a couple of years ago with the baseball team at Arkansas State University. Before that, you have to go back like 20 years to a rugby. Ken Christensen was, I think, a rugby or lacrosse player at the University of Minnesota, was killed in a hazing incident. So there's 20 years separate the last two athletic hazing deaths, whereas there's, I think, on average 3 or 4 per year on college campuses coming from fraternities or sororities. So it is very different, and responsible adults who have power, i.e. coaches, typically don't allow that sort of thing to happen. So that's what I think makes the Northwestern case so unique. As soon as I read that, I was like, man, there's no way the coaches weren't aware of what's going on. Like, it's just not possible. It defies.
How surprised were you? Were you surprised?
Very. Yeah. I mean, I keep reading, like, it's mind blowing that, especially a school like Northwestern, like Northwestern's culture, its reputation academically, and now these lawsuits, it's like volleyball, baseball, like this was systemic throughout apparently the entire athletic department. If what's being alleged in these lawsuits are true, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I was shocked when I read some of this stuff because, again, this isn't a fraternity house basement off campus. This is stuff that's happening in locker rooms.
Yeah, point taken. I think I probably did too much generalization, but let me ask differently then. Should there be a different definition for, I mean, I guess, is there some okay hazing, some acceptable hazing, sports tradition or team tradition that if you're a freshman, you expect to go through this kind of tradition. It might not be, you might not rise to the point of humiliation, but you might have to do this because the seniors before you had to do it. And is that fair to say that's part of the culture in college sports? It doesn't have to be violent or degrading, but is that a tradition that you have to do things when you're a freshman?
Do I think that some things that might be construed as hazing could be beneficial for group culture, team culture, bonding, brotherhood, belonging, connection? Absolutely, right? So the challenge for colleges and universities is to have a subjective way to determine what's acceptable and what's not, right? And so I think that's, as opposed to the way a lot of colleges have historically defined it, which is just a running list of prohibited behaviors. Aldo's definition gives you the ability to sit down and subjectively say, okay, like, I can see the benefit of this. I can see how this is working. And after talking to all the members of this team, how it breaks down barriers, brings people together. Is it demeaning? Maybe a little bit, but maybe I'm willing to accept a little bit of demeaning in order to accomplish these things that we've agreed are relevant to the group. So Yeah, it's a difficult line for colleges and universities to walk in particular, because they're not the only ones who deal with it. And, Dimitri, you talked about that, and Aldo's talking about that as hazing as a human problem, but it tends to be much more of an issue on college campuses. We're seeing a lot more with high schools, especially sports teams, within adolescence. But yeah, there's a need to address it and to be able to name it when you see it, and deal with it. And so having a correct definition, some people might be listening to this and scratching their heads, why are they so caught up on the definition? It's because the definition is actually important. That's the starting point of like how we address it, is to be able to describe accurately what it is, so we can know it when we see it, and then address it. So I do think the definition is really important.
Well,
and I would think that.
Go ahead, Susan.
I would think that helps shape policy as well, based
Absolutely.
upon the definition. And one of the things that we had talked about during that podcast, it was mentioned and thrown around a no tolerance policy, where there's this blanket statement of no hazing. And I think I'm going to speak for Steph and Dimitri, but I think our take was that that's not going to be very effective.
No, it can't be. You can't be draconian in your approach to this. And when I coach campuses, essentially what I tell them is this: like, you have to address all levels of hazing, right? And I use this like 1 to 10 continuum to talk about hazing, and even the level 1 stuff, silly stuff, errand running, cleaning, whatever. It might technically be hazing. It's not the sort of stuff that keeps you up at night. But if that's happening in a team, you have to address it, because today's level 1 hazing becomes tomorrow's more serious hazing, right? And so colleges have to address any hazing regardless of severity, but zero tolerance implies that, we're going to kick you off campus if you're doing even the lowest level hazing. And I agree with you, Suzanne. That's not only impractical, it would probably be counterproductive in terms of just pushing the behavior further underground. And I think that's Aldo's other big contribution to our understanding of the problem. A lot of people like to moralize hazing, to kind of get on their high horse and, these terrible kids, these terrible people who are doing this. And, Aldo comes along and essentially says, no, this is in our nature. This is part of who we are. This is wired in. It makes you take a little perspective, particularly if you're someone who's working on a college campus, who's trying to address this stuff, to say, these aren't bad people. These are just human beings doing the things that human beings have been doing for thousands of years. So I think it gives you some valuable perspective, and it's further reason why zero tolerance probably is never going to work.
Right. And so that's the other thing I wanted to find out is, do you agree with Aldo's theory? I know you guys talked about it on your podcast together. Do you subscribe to the automatic accrual theory, and this is just an evolutionary kind of freeloading, an anti-freeloading policy?
Yeah, he's demonstrated it experimentally in the laboratory. We're actually working with him right now on demonstrating it in the real world. I do agree with him. Yeah, because I see it in my own work. When you look at the groups, and this is just purely anecdotal, qualitative observation, but it's important. It sheds light on what he's talking about. When you look at the groups, and let's look, fraternities and sororities are my expertise, so let's talk about that. The groups that often get in trouble for hazing, the groups that are engaged in the most egregious hazing, are almost always, not always, but almost always perceived to be the socially elite, quote unquote, top tier groups. The groups with the most benefit. So you join this group and you've got social clout, you have status, you have access to all the things you want to have access to in college. And so I'm willing to subject myself to a lot of things in a group like that in order to be part of that group. And so essentially what Aldo's saying is that groups have caught wise to that. And we can't let these people just exploit us, right? The free rider problem he talks about. So yeah, hazing has evolved to address that. I think that's why you see, Aldo's theory explains why you see hazing tend to be more severe in groups that have more benefits and more status. So that's, to me, it's obvious that what he's talking about is the correct way to think about it.
And what you mentioned too is also similar to when we talk about exchange theory and social psychology,
Sure.
right?
Do you that you and him kind of agree also on the policy shouldn't be zero tolerance? We all agree on that. You have sort of an embrace and reform kind of an idea. Agree that it's going to happen. Kind of look at it and decide whether or not this is something you should punish or not. Or
his
one of the
embrace and
things that-
reform ideas are very controversial in certain circles. I'm very fascinated by the concept. I wouldn't say I'm in the minority. I think people are curious with what he has to say, but we live in a world that is dominated by, at least on college campuses and with fraternities and sororities, legal liability, fear of lawsuits, right? Trial lawyers out there. And we're seeing that at Northwestern right now, the flurry of lawsuits that have come out in the last week or so. So embrace and reform essentially says, look, like we're going to essentially take an informed consent approach to hazing that will allow students to agree to be hazed up to a certain level. But if we can draw the line short of anything that we deem dangerous and we can trust in good faith that groups will stop there, might we, if the goal is to prevent injury or harm or death, then might allowing some hazing work to address that?
right.
And I'm
You
not
had
convinced that it would.
attorney.
I'm fascinated by this idea, but I'm still waiting for a fraternity's insurer to allow them to take that stance. I've yet to see the group that has signed off on that. So
Well,
Yeah, you had an
we'll see
attorney
if it happens.
suggest a contract when you enter a fraternity, them handing you a contract saying,
absolutely,
you know, to rush this fraternity, you're going to have to agree to this level of hazing. I think one of the suggestions was, you know, you're going to be driven to some, you know, 17 miles away or something and dropped off with like your underwear and you're going to have to walk back. I don't know any kid that's going to and have their parents sign off on that contract,
right.
especially in places like where it's cold.
And
You
then
know,
is it
and-
hazing if the person's volunteering to do it in essence?
Oh, it's hazing, but
That's
you're
a question that always
contractually
comes up.
obligated to agree to it now.
I'm more progressive. I'd say I would allow it when we're done defining what hazing is. I'd probably say fine if the community, the fraternity, the team wants to have some type of initiation tradition. Let's do some sublimation. Let's put it into good that you have to do so many community hours. You know, you have to go and clean up trash downtown, or you have to go and feed the poor, and you have and then when you do all this A, B, C, and D, then you can be part of our community. It could be used to good. So allow them to haze their freshmen, but in a good and acceptable and good way. You know, I don't think it's impossible.
I think, Dimitri, you mentioned this idea of voluntary hazing, that students go along with it. And I agree completely. And a lot of people say, well, that absolves the group, right? It's not hazing if the new members, kind of agreed to go along. And that's it's a problematic way of thinking about it, because there's a lot of good reasons why someone would go along with something even that is dangerous or problematic. And so, the new guys were okay with it is not a defense. The reason that hazing works to the extent that it does work, I think what it does better than anything is that it creates a sense of accomplishment, right? So I make it through a difficult new member process, and I feel like I've earned something. I feel like I've accomplished something, and it's high five, we made it through. What we're starting to demonstrate in the research, and Aldo's demonstrating it in his, we're demonstrating it in ours, though, is that short-term sense of accomplishment does not yield. So in Aldo's research, higher solidarity to the group. He's demonstrated that. And what we've demonstrated in our work is that it doesn't produce any additional commitment to the group. It produces very high levels of commitment in the short term. But when you move out even a semester or a year from the ending of the hazing, there's no correlation at all between the severity of the initiation and one's levels of commitment to the group. So whatever accomplishments are there in terms of what hazing does positively for the group appear to be minimal and short-lived. But it does create that short-term sense of accomplishment, and people really seem to fixate on that. And young men want that rite of passage. They do want to to feel like they've accomplished something in becoming part of that group.
Yeah, I
But
think we
we'll
talked about
probably,
that.
right. I was going to say we'll be more interested in knowing the long-term effect, right?
Oh, sure.
In the moment, in the 4 years that you're part of the team, you feel good about it. But I think that player from Northwestern did say he went into PTSD later on in his life, right after he finished college team sports. So you might think you might be caught in the moment and believing in an idea that you're actually passively getting into, not because you wanted to, but because you feel like you have to. And then in the long term, probably be a different reality altogether.
No
We
question.
had that debate last week when we talked about cognitive dissonance. It's something
Right.
like where you think
Yep.
you're liking them, but then I pointed out, well, if you're going to do that, then why don't you continue to haze them all 4 years or wherever? And that was the debate that we had. As we're running out of time here, I do want to ask two more things real quick. First, do you agree with my proposition that immigration is hazing, is a form of hazing?
I don't know that I got that reference.
Okay, that was
I think-
one of the points I made last week, is that the things that we do to the people that come into this country can be
Sure.
construed as hazing. But I thought about it over the course of the last couple of weeks, because our episode was 2 weeks ago now. And in the context of the definition that we're using, which is that the behaviors that we require have to be outside of the scope of the group. Some people would say that what we make our newcomers do would be within the scope of the group. We make them, learn
Sure.
about the country and pass a test.
How many
But-
native citizens could pass the test? I
But
don't
that's
know.
exactly what I was going to say, is how many people that were born in this country can pass this test?
So does
or
that go to the
do the thing.
excessive component?
Right.
So what I'm saying is, wouldn't that still qualify as hazing?
Yeah, I think it would come down to that notion of excessive, right? Is the test excessive? You have to have a process, right? Is it group relevant? Sure. Yeah, you could make that case. I don't know that I would make that case, but I could see how one could make that case.
And I think we also talked about some of the excessive things that happen to some immigrants that come in, that get arrested and get thrown into
Sure.
places they shouldn't get thrown into, which is not what the government does. It's what people who disagree with the way the government does things, they're taking things outside of their hands and doing it.
Absolutely.
So, okay. And before we let you go, unless anyone else has any other questions, I wanted to ask you one more thing, since you are an Alabama graduate, and
Oh, boy.
I'm a lifelong Hurricanes fan. Just want to point that out.
Oh yeah.
I grew up down here in South Florida, and I've been a Hurricanes fan my whole life. One of our first episodes that we did I think it was after the Heat lost Game 6 to Boston. It was one of the worst losses in South Florida sports history, and we did a top 5 worst losses in sports history, South Florida sports history. And one of my really good friends is from Alabama, and he's a huge Tide fan. And he will not let go that I did not put the 1993 Sugar Bowl on that list, where George Teague stripped Lamar Thomas running down the sidelines, because I think that's, until the Nick Saban years, I think that was the only thing Alabama had anything to look forward to look back on. So I'm asking you, do you believe
So
that is
I'm,
one of the worst losses in Miami sports history to make him happy?
I'm not as admittedly familiar with the canon of Miami historic football losses. My favorite Miami loss, my undergraduate degree, and my heart is with the University of Tennessee Volunteers. I live in Knoxville, and the '86 Sugar Bowl was a 35-7 beatdown that the Volunteers laid on the Hurricanes. That's one of my earliest memories as a kid. I was like 7 years
Oh
old
my
for
God.
Sports
that
is
game.
against
So
the Hurricanes.
Thank you.
that was I hope would make the list, because that was
Thank you.
national champion contender Vinny Testaverde, and the Vols came
Yeah.
to New Orleans and just laid the wood to the Hurricanes that game.
Appreciate
You-
that.
Dimitri, you walked into that one yourself.
Not that
Yeah.
he's taking any pleasure in telling you.
Not
No,
at all.
not at all.
None at all.
No, SEC SEC, no, not at all. Not any pleasure. I would think that being from Alabama, you wouldn't like the fact that the Volunteers win any games, but I guess,
Now, the
It's
Vols are
fine.
back, baby. We're in great shape.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And thanks for coming on. I hope we can consider you a friend of the show now. And
Definitely a friend of the show, and look forward to continuing to listen. Y'all have some engaging conversations.
appreciate it. And maybe we can have you back again if we have something to ask. Maybe with social psychology, Suzanne can help us out with that because she's on that. And now that I know that you're a social psychologist properly, I can do this properly.
Not an anthropologist. I mean.
Definitely not an anthropologist.
That's
No.
Aldo. That's Aldo.